Welcome to the Animal Wellness Podcast, all about improving the lives of animals with better policies and practices in government and business. Brought to you by Animal Wellness Action, where we believe helping animals helps us all. Here's your host, Joseph Grove.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Animal Wellness Podcast. I'm Joseph Grove. Today, we're taking a closer look at something many of us have encountered without ever giving much thought: animal festivals. From the running of the bulls in Spain to groundhog weather predictions in Pennsylvania, festivals featuring animals exist all over the world. Some are celebrated as cultural treasures, while others are seen as outdated, even cruel. These events often raise difficult questions. Are they harmless fun, or do they exploit animals for human entertainment? Do traditions justify practices that might otherwise be considered inhumane? And perhaps most importantly, can we honor our cultural heritage without harming the very creatures we claim to celebrate? Our guest today has explored these questions firsthand. Elizabeth MeLampy is the author of Forget the Camel, the Madcap World of Animal Festivals and What They Say About Being Human. It's a book that takes readers on a journey across the United States to witness these festivals up close. She traces their histories, examines the ethical dilemmas they present, and asks what they reveal about our relationship with animals and ourselves. Advocates for these festivals argue that they preserve history, boost local economies, and bring communities together. Organizers claim further that the animals aren't harmed, or some would say the animals even enjoy their participation. On the other hand, animal welfare groups point out that many of these traditions, from rattlesnake roundups to frog jumping contests, involve stress, injury, or even death for the animals involved. So today we are asking these big questions. What does our use of animals in festivals say about us as a species? Where do we draw the line between tradition and exploitation? And is there a way to celebrate animals without causing them harm? While in law school, Elizabeth worked on issues related to farmed animals, wild animals, and captive animals with Harvard's Animal Law and Policy Clinic. She also was in the inaugural cohort of emerging scholar fellows with the Brooks Institute for Animal Rights, Law, and Policy, where she worked on animal law scholarship. She has traveled the country attending these festivals, meeting with the people who run them, and grappling with the contradictions they present. We're excited to hear her insights and discuss what needs to change and what doesn't when it comes to animals in entertainment. So, Elizabeth, I get paid by the word. So it really behooves me to say as much as I can before I turn over the microphone.
That's great. You're saving me some of the work. I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
So here's a question for you. I'm on Disney's Island a couple weeks ago, and I go into the water, and they've got these stingrays, and they're swimming around, and they bring the stingrays. They've trained them to come up through like this little U shape, and they give you some kind of block of shrimp to hold under there or processed, and the stingrays suck it out from under your hand. Am I a bad person?
No, I don't think you're a bad person. I think animal encounters are built into how very many of us live our lives all the time.
I felt a little squishy going in because, of course, we are sponsored by Animal Wellness Action and we are an animal welfare group. So I felt a little squishy going in. But where I knew I had crossed a moral line and had waded hip deep into not only saltwater but hypocrisy was when the handler said that they trimmed off the stingers, right? So obviously people wouldn't get hurt and have a Steve Irwin done to them. And then I realized, holy cow, they're mutilating these animals so that I can come in and have a close-up encounter with them. So at any rate, I'd share that just because it's one of those areas where I knew going in that maybe I wasn't doing the right thing, and certainly became convinced of it right after the fact. What drew you to being interested in the employment of animals? Of course, this wasn't a festival per se or anything like that, but in the use of animals for entertainment, for tourist experiences, for shows.
I think, like you mentioned, this is a really important part of a lot of tourism, of a lot of the ways that we all interact with animals from the time when we're kids, even to now as adults. I think interacting with animals in these sort of public touristic ways is part of how we learn how we should interact with animals. And so your example of the stingrays in Disney, where they've been mutilated for touristic appeal or for safety, I think sort of asks those same questions of what benefit does that interaction bring to the human? And I think, many other visitors, I'm sure, had fun doing that, and they might have even learned something about stingrays. They might say you have to balance that with what harm are we imposing on the animals? What is this interaction doing for the animals? And if the answer is the harm's outweighing the good, I think that's a really important thing to start considering. Animals and entertainment, I think, are a really fruitful area to start to interrogate our own assumptions about animals. I think we all, every single one of us, myself included, have strong sort of traditions and history and feelings about animals used for all sorts of other purposes. So animals for food, or animals used for medical testing or cosmetic testing. We all come to those topics with a lot of baggage, for better or for better or for worse. And we all have preconceived ideas about those. But animals and entertainment, I think you lose a lot of the justifications that are offered in those other contexts. People say we need to eat animal protein to survive. We need medical testing on animals to produce vaccines, and et cetera, et cetera. But there's no need, so to speak, about animals and entertainment. It's entertainment, right? This is sort of this is a different category of animal use, and so I think it makes it a little easier to dig into in some ways, because you can sort of separate yourself from those more complicated justifications. So I find animals and entertainment to be really fascinating. I think they're really public displays of human-animal relationships, and I think they're really exciting because I think there's real opportunity for change within our lifetime, which is I always find exciting.
The justification for zoos, which I personally find abhorrent, is, well, how are we going to teach the kids, about these animals? And, of course, the response there is, well, kids are plenty interested in dinosaurs, and there are lots of ways to learn about dinosaurs. But as hard as I've tried to find one, there's no zoo with a T-Rex, right? So I think we even get into some of those questions, maybe at the fringe of that train of thought, or at the last car of it, at least, that, well, so what, we don't have, that experience, right? What makes anyone believe with certainty that animals are meant to be understood by us? I mean, there's certainly a speciesist argument. I'm not saying that right. An argument of arrogance, I suppose, that assumes, well, we're humans, therefore we have a right to know everything and to have encounters with everything. But I digress on that. You traveled to a lot of different kinds of events: the rattlesnake roundup, ostrich races, frog jumping contests. What struck you about these various events, and how would you rate them, maybe in terms, I don't know, of your own ethics, your own viewpoint?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the book covers 8 festivals, and I think they're 8 festivals that are particularly, I think they have really good stories, really long histories. They made for good narrative, I think, arcs. But they're not the only festivals out there. There are dozens and dozens of animal festivals all across the country. Every month of the year, I found them in many, many states, every region. I mean, these things are everywhere. But the 8 that I focus on are, so I group them into 3 categories, sort of looking at what's the core of the relationship that we're having with the animal here. And the first category is dominance, the second is humor, and the third is reverence. And so with those 3 categories, I try to start to kind of analyze what these festivals are doing to the animals. What's the takeaway here? How are we building upon our human-animal interactions to educate attendees about how we should be interacting with those animals? And those categories, they're not perfect, but I think they give a starting point to sort of diagnose what's going on with how the humans are using the animals at these events. So In the dominant.
Well, yeah, I was going to say before you even get into that. So when you categorize these in humor, reverence, dominance, etc., what do you mean by applying that category? Would you say that the festival is by nature designed to show our dominance over the animals, or it's primarily intended to elicit chuckles from attendees?
Yes, I think basically. So it's sort of what's the core function of this festival here, and I think again they're not perfect categories, and the book I view very much as a spectrum, despite having it in 3 parts. I think each festival in each part is not created equal, and that's part of the fun of ordering them in the way that I did is hoping to sort of build upon the last, and I think it's more of a spectrum than a clear cut line. But yeah, I think those 3 categories are good starting points. I think, and that's true when we all think about our relationships to animals, kind of out in the wild in the regular world. I think we eat animals, we laugh at funny animal videos, and we sort of love our dogs and cats in our house. And I think those 3 categories are good starting points for how we relate to animals more broadly.
All right. So let's go through them then. So you described 2 in terms of dominance: the rattlesnake roundup and then the lobster festival. Now, I guess some people eat rattlesnake, but it would seem to me that the main lobster event would be, primary culinary in nature. Why did you select those 2, and why do you subscribe them both to the dominance category?
The rattlesnake roundup was the easiest festival in this book to categorize. I think what the rattlesnake roundup I went to the one in Sweetwater, Texas. They happen elsewhere, but that's the one that I went to. They basically hunt and kill rattlesnakes in public, and they do eat the rattlesnake meat. They skin the rattlesnakes, and then the meat gets fried and sold to tourists and to attendees. And so it is this very visceral, kind of brutal event for the snakes, where there's hundreds, thousands of snakes, maybe thousands of snakes in a pit, and they behead them one by one. They make handprints with the blood. It's a very sort of violent event in the killing pit. There's lots of good at this event too. There's a carnival. There's other things going on, but the killing pit is sort of the center of that event. And so that one I knew right where it would go, right? That's kind of obvious when you think about how are we relating to snakes? Oh, we're trying to kill them. We're trying to eradicate them from the people's homes in that area. We're trying to educate people about how dangerous they are. That's a little more clear cut. The Maine Lobster Festival is an event that I wasn't quite sure where it would go at first, honestly. And, as I traveled to these events, I tried to keep a really open mind about what I would see. And so I always went in, I always did research first, of course, and you go in with some ideas about what might happen and how things might feel. But on the ground, you get a really different, perspective. And so at the Maine Lobster Festival, I was really sort of taken aback actually by how similar to the rattlesnake roundup it was. And not, maybe not in sort of the general vibes, for lack of a better word, but in terms of what was actually happening to the animals. So both festivals feature specialized hunters who go out into the wild and gather up, thousands of animals and bring them in alive to a central facility. Both festivals feature then killing those animals in public. So the beheading of the snakes at the rattlesnake roundup, or at the Maine Lobster Festival, they have the world's largest lobster cooker, and they would drop, hundreds of lobsters into vats of boiling lobsters right in front of attendees, and then serve them over at the food tent for people who wanted a lobster dinner. And they also both involve really visceral interactions with the body parts. So at the Snake Festival, there's a lot of people could touch the snake bodies. They could take pictures with the snake bodies. You could buy snake meat. You could buy snake skins. And at the Maine Lobster Festival, they sold Christmas ornaments made out of the lobster claws. Obviously, eating a lobster whole is a very visceral experience. It's very, with your hands, and it's very messy. And so as I kind of attended this and looked around and saw what was happening, the core activity that was happening at these two events was the same. It's mass killing of animals that are brought in from the wild, sort of for us, whether I think we commonly think about lobster as a food animal, and we commonly don't think that way about snakes, but that's really the only difference. Otherwise, these festivals have killing at the core of each of them.
Yeah, and then I suppose one could add the nuance that rattlesnakes are a predator, relative to humans, and unless one gets one's toes pinched by a lobster, they're relatively innocuous to us. Did you perceive when you were at these two festivals, which were different in that way you just mentioned, a difference in attitude among the participants? Was there a bloodlust, a carnality to it? Did you perceive that the people in attendance there were operating at a different psychological level than they might have been at the frog jumping event, let's say?
I think it's really important to remember the nuances between the two. And I definitely think, as similar as those events are, there are obvious differences too. So at the Rattlesnake Roundup, they were going to kill every single rattlesnake that they found, that they brought in. And that was the purpose. The point was to kill these animals. At the Maine Lobster Festival, they only killed as many as they thought they could serve at the food tent, because if they kill the lobster too soon, they lose that profit. And so it's a much more, it's an industry that is running that, and it's much more industry focused. And so there were differences even between the attendees at those two festivals. I think the average person who sits down to a lobster dinner, I'm not sure there's bloodlust going through them, but I can't be inside someone else's head. But what I saw in Sweetwater was people squeezing the blood down a decapitated snake's neck, rubbing their hands together, and then making handprints with it. And so, that's a really different engagement with what it means to kill that animal, with what it means to interact with that body than you would see at the Maine Lobster Festival. And then, of course, at all the other events in the book, there's no purposeful killing. And so it's even more different than that. And so that's an example of what I meant by I view these events on a spectrum more than, clear categories in some ways.
Right. It seems almost primitive, barbaric, that notion of engaging with the snake's blood, the handprints. It's almost, and boy, I'm treading, I guess, maybe on some thin ice here, but like behavior you might hear described to a primitive tribe that had never been in contact, let's say, with other civilizations, or something you might hear about with a sacrificial practice where there is that romancing of the blood.
Yeah, I think, like I said, I can't say what was going through people's heads, but I do think what was on display is something that then I could see and I could make my own judgments about. And what was on display was a very clear interest in engaging with the fear. And so it was fear. They wanted to engage with that visceral concepts of the blood and of the snake skins. And tourists can skin a snake if they want. They can go to this event and they can do it themselves. They're part of what they're peddling is the story of humans are meant to dominate snakes. We're meant to kill them. We're meant to do these things. And that, as part of that story, they get, I think it's become such a tradition. They've done this event for over 60 years. It has a lot of lore to it. It has a lot of community importance to it. And so in that way, it does get entrenched in the local community.
Sure. Well, thank you for all of that. And was it horrifying for you to be there? How did you feel when you were watching the snakes go through that?
It was very hard to watch. We in the United States live in a society where most slaughter happens behind closed doors. We don't see a lot of engagement with what it means to kill an animal, most of us, most days. And I think in some ways that's a really good thing. But in other ways, I think watching that, seeing with your own two eyes, imagining how those animals must feel and suffer, it was eye-opening in many ways. And I think it helped write not just that chapter, but then the rest of the book. There's always this frame of reference for everything else that was happening. You can always come back to, this snake slaughter as, I think, such a clear example of what it means to kill an animal in such a brazen fashion.
Did you consider going to any cockfighting derbies?
No, I did not. In part because I think this book I wanted to keep very, I think the quirkiness of some of these events makes them more approachable and makes them more fun to read about. And cockfighting, I think, there's a lot kind of out there written about it. In many places it's illegal. And I did the same with horse racing and rodeos, or two other big categories I didn't look at in this book. And, in part because I think people come to those topics with so much preconceived ideas about them. And I think there's some power in saying, let's put all the big stuff to the side. What about all this other stuff that's happening? And let's really investigate what we think about those, and then we can transfer it over. So rather than talk about the rodeo explicitly, I'm hoping that this book will help people think differently about these topics more broadly. And then, that might carry forward to other areas too.
Yeah, we do quite a bit of work on the topic of cockfighting with Animal Wellness Action. We're sponsoring legislation that would increase penalties. We're championing that legislation, and it's a fascinating. I wouldn't call it a sport, but it's a fascinating pastime. Let's euphemize it that way. And I heard. One argument that was made to a woman who rescues these fighting roosters that talked about or justified it as, tradition, something that's handed down from father to child, how it's a better activity for young people in these smaller communities than, say, hanging out, with friends, getting wacky on the junk, right? There's such a cultural milieu surrounding the whole enterprise that it would be fascinating, I think, for someone to really study it from both sides. And of course, it wouldn't ameliorate for us the cruelty of cockfighting and the need for it to end. But it's easy to vilify cockfighters, but maybe too easy.
Exactly.
So, enough on that. Yeah. I don't want to cut you off, but I that's all I had to say on it.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think my book really thinks about exactly what you just said about tradition and how does tradition really reinforce some of these events and sort of make them outlive their otherwise kind of natural lifespan. I think people do things because they've always done them, not so much doing them because they make sense in this exact moment. And how we interact with our traditions is one of the core messages I hope to leave readers with at the end of this book, which is that, traditions are important and they're valuable and they bring us all meaning and they bring us all a sense of ourselves and where we came from. But we don't have to blindly follow them. We can choose to interact with our traditions in a way that is more in line with the rest of our values and more in line with sort of where we want the world to go.
You're listening to the Animal Wellness Podcast. We'll be right back after this quick word from our sponsor.
This is Wayne Pacelli with Animal Wellness Action. We depend on countless people like you to support our fight for animals. Join us today by donating to further our campaigns to spare countless animals from cruel and needless pharmaceutical tests. Put an end to animal fighting, liberate farm animals from extreme confinement, and so many others. Become a donor at any amount. Visit animalwellnessaction.org/donate to join our fight against animal cruelty of all kinds. That's animalwellnessaction.org/donate. Thank you.
Now, back to the Animal Wellness Podcast.
Let's move then to something that's a little more humorous, and you categorize these next two events that way: the camel and ostrich races and the jumping frog jubilee. So let's talk about the frogs first, because I have to admit that sounds like a fun thing to watch for me, unless they boil the frogs and eat them at the end.
The frog jumping contest was actually quite fun to watch, and that it was very pleasant. It's sort of in the rolling hills out in California. And the whole weekend had sort of a real carnival flair to it. There was a full carnival set up with rides and games and lots of art shows and craft competitions and things like that sort of going on in the background. But the core competition of this event was jumping frogs, which is a activity that's based on a Mark Twain story. The story that made Mark Twain famous is called The Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. And in that story, the main character basically makes a bet that his frog can jump farther than another person's frog. And so in order to sort of recreate that and engage with the history of Mark Twain being in this California town, they put on this jumping frog jubilee every year and now jump hundreds of frogs, and it's become quite an event. So yeah, it was fun to see, and it definitely had a lot of quirks to it that I think made it really engaging and interesting. But the core principle of the event is still using animals for fun. And so the welfare component of the frog jumping contest, I think, is a little harder to see maybe, but it's just as important to start to investigate. So I think that chapter is where the book starts to take a turn towards caring about these animals. And so the frog, at the frog jumping contest, they have a true emphasis on welfare. So there's a frog welfare policy, there's a frog welfare officer. They really do want to take measures to take care of these frogs that they're jumping. But at the end of the day, frogs only jump because they're afraid, and they're jumping really far in this setting because they're really afraid. And so it does raise questions about, okay, we're not killing the frogs, it's not like the snakes, but is it good, permissible, beneficial, worth it to be terrifying, taking these frogs from the wild and then terrifying them, and sort of for what? Just because it's fun? That's sort of the question that frogs raises.
There's something overtly sadistic about scaring any animal, human or non-human animal, for enjoyment. And of course, you see, on the TikTok, all kinds of videos of folks scaring other people, putting, I forget what it is that they put behind cats in some of these videos, that when the cat turns around, it terrifies them, because I think the cat thinks it's a snake at first. It's inherently sadistic, I think, to do that. How do they scare these frogs? Just make a bunch of noise, bang on the board? What do they do to get these frogs to jump?
So the first step in jumping a frog is to place a frog on the starting lily pad, which is just sort of cemented onto the stage. And then the frog jockeys, which is what they call the humans who are doing this, there's all sorts of different techniques. And this is, to your point about fathers passing things down to sons, this is very much true in Calaveras County. These are family heirlooms. They're secrets of how they get frogs to jump. But there's all varieties of sort of stomping behind them, lunging at them, sort of making coming in sort of in a plank position, some kind of tower over them. I mean, there's all different techniques, but some variation of stomping or lunging behind the frogs.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. How do they get the ostriches to race? I mean, camels, I don't know, maybe they're a little bit more like horses, I'm assuming, because they look more like horses. I don't know, that they might enjoy running, as the argument goes that thoroughbreds do. How do you get an ostrich to race another ostrich?
So the international camel and ostrich races are not a serious race. So they are not racing for speed or for endurance or anything like that. They are essentially contests of who can hold on to the animal the longest. And so these ostriches they're not, like you said, they're not meant to be mounted and ridden. They can't sustain the weight of a human on their back for very long at all. So they get them to run by sitting on them, and the ostriches desperately want to get these humans off of them. And so the ostriches are running. They go sometimes in circles, sometimes they fall before they get a chance to sort of run away. I watched as an ostrich skidded onto its chest. The rider flew over the ostrich's head onto the ground. In front of it, at the same time, another ostrich in the next kind of set over, the ostrich was pulling forward and the rider was sliding off to the side and about to hit the ground really hard. So the point is not, to get the ostrich to run fastest around the track. The point is to try to hold on as long as they can while sitting on top of this bird that desperately does not want a rider.
Right. And the camels?
The camels, they mount and they run same thing around the track. They try to, I think the goal nominally is to get to the finish line, but it's the same sort of event as the ostrich, where the camels are running really fast and their humps make it really hard to get settled on the back of a camel when they're running. And so it's the same sort of slapstick humor going on with the ostriches, that people would fall off these camels, almost every heat, almost every time they do a race. One or more of the jockeys would fall off. And that was part of the event. That's part of what was funny. And people around me were laughing, cracking up. And I think that slapstick quality, it's like America's Funniest Home Videos. It's when people sort of are getting hurt in a way that seems benign because everyone got up and walked away. That causes a humor reaction in most of us. So it was definitely a certain kind of humor.
Mm-hmm. You no doubt had empathy going for the animals. What was your read on what the ostriches and camels were when they were going through this, right? When you watched the animal rather than the hapless riders, what did you feel?
To me, the animals looked afraid. I think they desperately wanted out of that situation. They wanted these riders off of them. And I think, I could be anthropomorphizing, but I think that's certainly what I saw in what was happening, and I think the best evidence of that I had was in one of the ostrich heats. So there was 3 ostriches getting lined up they have these like starting chutes, sort of like little grates, just like a horse race. They start in these chutes, and they were lining up, and one of the riders couldn't mount the ostrich. The ostrich wouldn't let her, like they just couldn't get her on top. The ostrich was fighting too much. And it was the ostrich was fighting so much that they eventually started the heat without the rider. They just said, that rider won't get to ride this round. And so I think that just goes to show how much these ostriches don't want it. They don't want to have a rider on their back, and they don't, they're not pleased with it from the moment it starts until the moment they're recaptured by handlers and walked back to the start line. I think the whole thing is an exercise in how long can we force these animals to do something that's very unnatural for them.
Right. Probably the least harmful would be the events that celebrate the butterflies, the returning of them, the returning of the swallows. What did you perceive to be the mood, the intent of the folks who attended those events, and how do you respond as someone who was an animal advocate in the face of those events?
The last section of the book is called Reverence. And so the event you're referring to is one that I write the last chapter on before the conclusion. And it's on the Butterfly Days Parade and Festival in Pacific Grove, California. And the Butterfly Days event is just one of many. Lots of communities have events welcoming migrating either butterflies or other birds, buzzards in Ohio or the swallows in San Juan Capistrano. There's lots of events like this. And these events, I went to Butterfly Days in Pacific Grove, and that event was so quaint and sweet. And I just think it was a classic small town event. There was not a lot of the hullabaloo that surrounded the other events in the book. And because of that, it had a really different quality to it. And I think in some ways it's easy to look at those events and say, wow, this was so much better. This was no animals got hurt, all of those things. And that's all true. It is better, in my opinion, if no animals get hurt. But I think the core of who was attending that event is not that dissimilar from the rest of the events in the book. And I think that's one of the threads I hope comes across, is that at Butterfly Days, most of the attendees were families. The kindergartners in town dress up like monarchs and parade down the street. It's part of how they celebrate this event every year. And so the kindergartners, the preschoolers are dressed as little caterpillars, just before the monarch phase. And it's all family friendly, family focused event. And I think that is truly what's going on at the rest of the events too. Even if I disagree maybe with some of how they're treating animals. I mean, even the Rattlesnake Roundup in Sweetwater, Texas was filled with families, and they were filled with families having, getting lunch out at this fair and interacting with each other, seeing each other, spending time as a community, all of that. And they were raising money for community benefits, like, civic causes that would go back into the community. They were, and same thing with the camel and ostrich races. I just sat here and told you how horrible they were, but I was surrounded by families. Everyone was enjoying the day. And so I think that's the quality of the attendee, like the type of attendee, I should say, isn't necessarily different. But I think the message that we're sharing about animals, the message that we're teaching kids and attendees and social media audiences and all of that, that's what's different. It's the story that we're telling about the animal at the center of the event that changes based on location, based on community, based on history, based on culture, based on all of those things. But at the end of the day, festivals are fun events for families to gather at. That's why we do them. That's why that's kind of that's true across the board.
Mm-hmm. When you were at these events, did you share with people why you were there, what your themes perhaps of this book would be? And if so, how did the attendees react to you shared that with?
I did at most of them. And the attendees that I interacted with were all fascinated, I would say, almost across the board. And the most common response I got was, "Oh, that's so interesting. Have you heard of this animal festival?" They from their own town or a town that they grew up in or a town that they have family in, they'd share a story about an animal festival that often I had never heard of because they were usually smaller. And I think the best example of that, I was at Groundhog Day in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, and I was at a banquet the night before Groundhog Day. They do a sort of a welcome banquet for people, and I had gotten tickets, and we sat at this table with other attendees, and I shared that I was working on this book, and a man at the table said, "Oh, have you heard of Buzzards Day in Ohio?" And I said, "No, I hadn't." And, he shared more about that with me. And I think it just goes to show how prevalent these animal festivals are. Again, I picked 8, but there are dozens and dozens out there that we could choose from. And so to me, that just highlights the importance of looking at this category of animal festival as a whole, rather than drilling down. And I mean, the other event that I talk about in the book is the Iditarod. I use it sort of to anchor the introduction. And, it's easy to talk about a single event like the Iditarod. We could write a whole book on the Iditarod. Many people have. But when you start zooming out and you gather all of these small town events or big town events, but all of these events where animals are at the center of the celebration, you start to realize there's something really interesting and important going on here. I mean, it's a abiding habit of humans to use animals in this way.
Yeah. We're fascinated by them. I think we love them. We certainly, care about some species a great deal, dogs, cats, and others not so much, but the magnetism of attending anything that really focuses on animals, I think, is undeniable. Where it becomes a matter of discernment, I suppose, is what exactly is happening to the animal, and I suppose even a larger one: is it ethical for someone who is interested to a great degree in animal welfare to be a patron of any of them? You include a section also on the Scopes monkey trial, which seems a bit out of place, maybe among other animal festivals. Why did you include that, and what did that event teach you?
The Scopes trial was the original trial took place in 1925, so about 100 years ago this summer. And it was when John T. Scopes was put on trial for teaching evolution in Tennessee. Tennessee had recently banned teaching evolution in public schools at the time. And so he was prosecuted. It was basically a test case to challenge this law banning evolution. And the trial in 1925 became this massive media storm. I mean, it was pitted as religion versus science, kind of, writ large. It was this big event. And then it became really famous because of the movie and play adaptations of Inherit the Wind. And it has a lot of lore in American sort of society and in legal circles as well. And in Dayton, Tennessee, where this happened, the original courthouse, they have since outfitted basically to be a theater. And every summer they put on the Scopes Trial Play and Festival, where they reenact aspects of the trial through a play script, and commemorate the history that Dayton was a part of 100 years ago now. And that festival, I went not really sure what to expect, but I think as I did more research and as I kind of did a lot more reading into what was actually being said about evolution in 1925, the more I realized that the question underlying that trial, I think it's often billed as religion versus science, but the real question to me, the under-examined one, is what separates a human from an animal. And that question was so foundational to these debates about evolution, in large part because I think it's foundational to who we are, right? Like, we want to know who we are, and we want to know how we relate to the world around us. And I think evolution was saying, we're just another animal. That was the answer they were offering is we're not that different than monkeys. We're not that different than dogs. We're just sort of, and we evolve differently. Whereas the sort of traditional understanding by many then and now is that humans are special. We are ensouled. We have reason and ration and sort of we're different, right? We have language. We have all these things that make us different than animals. And so I think the evolution theory challenged that assumption that humans are superior, basically, by offering this other explanation that, humans are just the same thing as animals. We are animals. And so that question, I think, offers a really philosophical way to end the book, is to sort of say, why do we do all of this? Why are we messing with animals at all? And I think the answer is partly because we have to understand the difference between us and them. We have to be able to look around the world, and it's so much easier to define something in the negative, to say, I can't say who I am, but I can say I am not like that. I am not, I am different than my cat. I don't, sit in a tree on my window all day and sleep. I'm different than my cat. It's really easy to do that. It's much harder to say, what makes Elizabeth Elizabeth? We all have some answers, but none of us have perfect answers. And so I think that's part of what's going on with animal festivals, is that we're, as a species, as humans, we're performing our human identity. We're saying, over and over again, here's animals, here's how we interact with them. And then at the end of the festival, when it wraps up, we, put the frogs back in the wild, the ostriches and camels go back into their pens, the, groundhog, Punxsutawney Phil, and after Groundhog Day just goes back into his burrow. Like everyone kind of goes back to normal. And for us, for humans, that means going back to being superior. It means going back to our human-centered place in this world. And so for a weekend, we interact with animals. We reinforce those paradigms. But then at the end of the day, we're able to emerge kind of fully human again. And so it's a little more of a philosophical thought process. It's definitely not like the other animal festivals, but I thought it was a good place to end the book, to sort of help zoom out and sort of say, kind of like at a macro level, what's the psychology here? What's at stake here? What's the why are we doing this? That answering that sort of question.
How was your thinking different after you went to these festivals and wrote your book than it was before?
I think before I wrote this book, I thought the answers would be easy. I thought that, I'd go to these festivals and I would have a clear cut, these are good, these are bad, here's how these should move forward. I think we all often like to think we have more answers than we do. And then after visiting these communities, after talking with people, after trying to talk to some people and not being responded to, after doing a lot of textual research, after really thinking through these things as hard as I possibly could for years, there are no easy answers. I think it's something that is a hard place to end up, because I think I know where I would go. I don't really think any of these animal festivals should be happening, save maybe the sort of the most reverential, the ones like Monarch or like Butterfly Days, where the monarchs get to be in the wild and we're not hurting them. Other than those, everything else I think harms animals and reinscribes, teaches people how animals are inferior to humans. But that's just me. That's like my personal opinion. And I think everyone is entitled to their own. And so the book sort of rewriting the book sort of led me down this path of, there's lots of different answers to the question of where do we go now? I think that it's easy from the outside to say what you think a community should do. It's obviously different to sort of, take into account all the complexities that I saw on the ground. So all of the good things that come from these events. A lot of these events happen in small towns that really need the money that they get from these events. These events bring like 40 or 50,000 people to town. That fills the hotels, that fills the restaurants. I mean, it really kind of, it benefits the whole community and in many cases, the whole county. And that's a good, we can't ignore that. We can't just say, let's wipe off the map, all of these events, because the communities really rely on them. And so I think the long-winded answer to your question is the working on this book made me understand the complexity of human animal relationships even more than I already had. But I will say this book also really gave me hope. I think there's a real opportunity for growth and change. And I think animal festivals are a really interesting and hopeful place to watch that happen in the next few years and in our lifetime. And I think the more and more we start talking about these festivals and we start saying, why are we doing this? No, but really why? Not just because we've always done it, but why are we doing this now this year? That's a choice. Why are we doing it? I think those investigations, those interrogations will really help us come to a more compassionate place where animals are not just props or tools, but they're sort of creatures that are given real deference to their own embodied experience on this planet.
Thank you for listening to the Animal Wellness Podcast. Please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and follow Animal Wellness Action on Facebook, X, Instagram, and LinkedIn. To stay current with all of our news and information and to take action to help animals, sign up at animalwellnessaction.org. Until next time, remember, helping animals helps us all.